Welcome to this, the third of our engaging, informative lectures and discussions with Slate's Dahlia Lithwick. This is the final session of the 2020 Sinai Temple Scholar in Residence program. I am Abner Goldstine, and here together with my wife, Roz, we are both privileged to be the sponsors of this series.
We will shortly turn this over to Laurie Levinson to introduce Dahlia this evening. Laurie, together with her husband, Doug Morell, are longtime active members of Sinai Temple. Laurie is a professor of law at Loyola Law School and a visiting professor at UCLA and Pepperdine. She is a frequent commentator for TV and NPR on a wide range of legal issues. Among her role at Loyola Law, Laurie leads the school's Project for the Innocent.
Let me take an extra minute to share with you something that Laurie has put on her Loyola faculty bio. She says, "I love the law and love teaching students. I found that we learn from each other. Unlike what many people think, there is not a big gap between the real world and law school. Law school simply gives students an atmosphere to search for the best and the fairest answers." How fitting for the overall theme of this program, Beit Din Ma'alah, the court on high.
Here is our good friend, Laurie Levinson.
Welcome, my name's Laurie Levinson, and it's an absolute pleasure to introduce this year's Scholar in Residence at Sinai Temple. It's Dahlia Lithwick, and she is a national treasure. She is a lawyer, she is a journalist, she is the senior editor at Slate, and she herself, frankly, is keeping democracy alive. Additionally, Dahlia is a proud and practicing Jew. She has amazing academic credentials, her undergraduate degree from Yale, her law degree from Stanford, and through her writing, she brings reason and clarity to what's happening in our nation. Now, in addition to her writing, you're all familiar with her amazing podcast, Amicus, with Dahlia Lithwick. She is passionate, she is committed, and you know what, folks? She is right. She's an unapologetic voice for conscience and reason for all Americans. I want to thank Abner and Roz Goldstine for bringing us such an inspired choice for this year's Scholar in Residence and sponsoring this event. Thank you, Dahlia Lithwick, for always speaking tactless, the truth, and making Americans look in the mirror. Thank you for being here and for your courageous and brilliant work. Welcome to Sinai Temple.
Wow, thank you, Laurie. These introductions get more Jewish motherish every time. So I'm delighted to be back, and Laurie and I are going to do the Q&A about half an hour from now. And I guess I just want to start by thanking Laurie for that gorgeous introduction, by thanking Rabbi Wolpe and Rabbi Rebecca Small, the amazing staff at Temple Sinai, and of course, Abner and Roz Goldstine, and just your entire community that has made me feel so cherished and so welcome from so far away all week long. I confessed in the green room right before we started that I'm a little bit bereft knowing that this is our last evening together. And I just want to tell you, as weird and alienating as Zoom is, this has been really meaningful to me. So Laurie's going to be my interlocutor in about 30 minutes, and I am going to urge you again to text whatever questions you have to the number that is on your screen. And don't feel you have to constrain yourselves. You've all been very mindfully texting largely questions about the topics of the lectures, but I'm sure you have myriad questions about the court, the new court as it's now constituted, the term that just began, what's coming, possibly about the court and the election. So please feel free to ask whatever questions that are weighing on you, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. So today's topic is RBG and the Jewish justices. And as you'll recall, we started this journey together talking really deep in the weeds about First Amendment doctrine and the history of that doctrine and the trends in it. And then on Tuesday, we talked in some detail about the very, very complicated conversations that we have around faith as part of our confirmation process. And I think we concluded Tuesday's lecture with Rabbi Wolpe asking a series of really interesting and probing questions about the connection between Catholics and Jews that now make up almost the entirety of the court, and the roots that that might have either in their religious histories or religious tradition or religious way of thinking about the world. And I wanted to pause before we dive in on this question of Jewish justices to say something I should have said probably last Sunday in the first lecture, which is, by definition, some of these conversations really involve a lot of weird essentializing about faith. And I've certainly caught myself this week making broad stroke statements like Catholics all think this and Jews all believe this and we value this and we value this. And again, this is just by definition very, very essentializing and broad brushstrokes. And in some ways, there's going to be a little bit more of that tonight. But I think that I want to just open with an answer that Rabbi Wolpe asked about at the end of the last lecture, which is, why is it that Catholics and Jews so dominate the current Supreme Court? If you count the way we've been counting, 8 of the 9 sitting justices are either Catholic or Jews. And Neil Gorsuch, who was raised as a Catholic, is now a practicing Episcopalian. We really do have a very, very heavily weighted court away from what is representative of the bulk of the American population. And I just wanted to quote, this is John Fay, professor of American history at Messiah College, which is an evangelical college, who is venturing an answer to Rabbi Wolpe's question about why these two faiths seem now to have commandeered the ground. And he says, quote, unlike evangelicals who base their entire worldview on the teachings of the Bible, Catholics and Jews seem much more open to engaging in larger principles that will affect not only their own community, but the common good of the republic or the nation beyond the needs of their particular religious traditions. And he goes on to say in a different place, but he says, unlike Catholicism and Judaism, both of which have a long intellectual tradition, American evangelicism is practical in focus. And again, I want to say that these conversations get really bogged down really quickly in those kinds of very, very broad claims. But I do think that as we move forward today, as we make sweeping claims about American Jews, let's be mindful of the fact that the difference between a Stephen Breyer, for instance, and a Louis Brandeis is vast and huge, and that in some ways, using religion as the prism to look at the justices, as we've been doing all week, sometimes obscures more than it clarifies. So I also want to just read to you a piece of a law review that dives into this question of why Justice Scalia, the way he approached the Constitution, was somehow an inherently Catholic enterprise. And I found a great quote that said, Scalia's commitment to textualism and to the principle of certainty of outcomes is all traceable to his Catholic upbringing. So the more you dig for these kinds of claims, the more you will find them. And whether or not you choose to find them useful, well, that is something we can take up in the Q&A. So I want to start by just reiterating what I said, I think, on the very first day, which is The extent to which the US Supreme Court has been a Protestant stronghold throughout history cannot be overstated. From 1790 to 1980, of the 101 men, and they were always men, appointed to the Supreme Court, 90 were Protestants. Now, as we sort of have hinted at throughout these conversations, the fact that now we have Jews and Catholics is either a good thing. It means that there's no longer a Jewish seat and a Catholic seat and everyone else is Protestant, and we've just stopped caring. Jeff Rosen, the president and CEO of the Constitution Center, describes it that way. We just don't care anymore. Religion doesn't matter anymore. And that's why, in some sense, we've got these numbers that are pretty warped. The other construction of the same thing is there's something really fundamentally wrong in a country that is 25% evangelicals, 25% atheists, and the court reflects none of that, zero of that. And that is, in some people's view, really distorting and wrong. And in case you think it's not really a thing, I would remind you that when Barack Obama tapped Elena Kagan to be at the Supreme Court, Pat Buchanan created a media firestorm when he suggested there are just too many Jews and too few Protestants on the high court. I don't think it was a direct piece of anti-Semitism per se, but it was certainly a claim about how the court no longer, in his view, reflects the interests or priorities of Protestants at all. So I want to talk just very briefly about some of the theories for why Jews and Catholics have come to seemingly dominate at the highest court of the land. And the easiest answer, which might be actually the clearest and most descriptively accurate answer, is that it's simply a proxy for abortion. As Rabbi Wolpe and I may have concluded on Tuesday's lecture, maybe there's no other way to ask about abortion. And so we use religion in a proxy war. And that's why it's just very, very useful in some sense to put people on the court whose religion somehow inform how they might think about abortion. And that becomes a kind of useful cue, a shorthand, if you will. There's a broader version of that same analysis that essentially says, no, but it's a good proxy for general political truths. And we should be clear that Democratic presidents have appointed 7 of the 8 Jews who have ever sat on the court. Benjamin Cardozo, the second Jewish justice, was the only one who was nominated by a Republican, Herbert Hoover. Conversely, every single one of the current Catholics on the court was appointed by a Republican president, with the exception of Sonia Sotomayor, who was appointed by Barack Obama. So in some sense, these become political proxies. Jews seem to be aligned with the left, goes the theory, and Catholics seem to be aligned with the right, goes the theory. Now, again, we can talk about how that might be true in some cases, certainly not in all cases. It's increasingly confounded by what has developed in the Jewish community, and I suspect also in the Catholic community. But that is one possible theory of why this happens. There's one other theory that's kind of interesting, and we'll get to it when we talk about Justice Brandeis, but that is that somehow the larger circuitry of the lower federal courts, of the district courts and the circuit courts, are also really heavily freighted towards Jews and Catholics, who then pick clerks who are Jews and Catholics, who are then elevated up the ranks, and that the circle actually has become increasingly closed. I read a funny piece today by someone who said, if you consider the fact that virtually everyone on the current US Supreme Court went to Harvard or Yale, which is true, and he goes on to say, a third of my class at Yale was Jewish, well, then it's probably not an accident that those groups get highly, highly overrepresented at the Supreme Court. So the last thing I'll say on this point, again, do with these hypotheses what you will, is that the most likely answer for why the court has really become very, very, very heavily weighted towards these two religious groups is that, as we discussed in the first lecture, as the court itself becomes the fulcrum in these very, very central political and ideological fights about the role of religion in public life in America, faith becomes a marker for that faith becomes a way of saying, if in fact we're going to sort of be chipping away at the Establishment Clause, eroding the wall between church and state, at the same time lifting up religious liberty claims, as we've seen in the last few decades, well, then religion itself becomes a marker of how you're going to feel about that. And Rod Dreher, who's a leading light of the Christian right, recently put this extremely well in explaining why evangelicals were so comfortable with Catholic justices. And what he said is, the best Christians can hope for is that judges and lawmakers will make it possible for us to live our lives fully as Christians, even in the public square. And so if in some sense you take abortion out of the central picture and you put in the central picture this burgeoning jurisprudence of how much can you live a religious life in the public square, I think religion does itself become a proxy for that. So finally, I think it's worth saying on this front that both Catholics and Jews were subject to the same economic and historic pressures and forces that kept them out of the law initially, and then really flooded the zone with both religions later on. So for a lot of Catholics and a lot of Jews who were immigrants coming to this country a century or more ago, law school becomes the ticket. Law school becomes the ticket to the middle class and to success. And in addition, even when the academy was closed to so many Jews and so many Catholics, the doors were open in law schools far earlier. And so law school becomes kind of the on-ramp for new immigrants who are seeking to better themselves. And that really in the late 19th century becomes the reason that Jews flood into law school and into the legal academy. And I think that it's useful to think about this through the frame that Ruth Bader Ginsburg always used, because she talked constantly about how the law was very much closed to Jews for some amount of time, but she would always go on to say, even if some parts of the law were closed, there were always lanes in which Jews could comfortably reside, and that Jews flocked to those lanes and then were very overrepresented in those lanes. And in some sense, she thought of it as a real signifier of Jews seeking equality, that they were quite literally voting with their feet when they went to law school because it was an avenue to greater success, but also a way to kind of pull up everyone who came behind in this larger fight for equality. And she wrote about that all the time. So the last thing I want to say on this is a really nice quote from Rabbi Evan Moffick, who says, "America was really special for Jews." And this is what he writes: "Until the American Constitution, Jews had never experienced equality under the law. We were always tolerated minorities, convenient scapegoats when economic and political times got tough. America alters this pattern." And he goes on to note the first Jewish leaders were never generals or kings, they were judges. And that there's this natural through line from Jews as judges in the biblical times, Jews that thought deeply about the law from those times, to the comfortable way that they inhabited that perch in the United States. So I'm going to talk really briefly about the Jewish justices, and then I want to talk a little bit more at length about RBG. Again, being mindful of the fact that you should please text whatever questions you have about anything, including like if you want to see my impressions of the justices, text them to the number that has been up on the screen, and we'll try to get to them. Lori and I will try to get to them. So the Jewish justices, as you probably know, there have been 8 in all. We talked about Justice Brandeis the other day and how really overtly anti-Semitic his confirmation process was. One irony about Justice Brandeis is that he was kind of the least self-identified Jew of all the Jewish justices, at least initially. He had a kind of a conversion, but he grew up his parents were sort of very educated German-speaking Jews from Prague. They wanted nothing to do with Jewish holidays, with kashrut, with ritual. His mother, he said, was averse to religious enthusiasm of any sort. She raised her children really to want nothing to do with specific parochial religion, but rather to embrace the ethical teachings of all religions. The Brandeis family celebrated Christmas every year. He did that with his own children. He didn't live near Jews, socialize with Jews, attend a synagogue, belong to a synagogue. And then he discovered the Zionist movement. And until then, he didn't even give tzedakah to Jewish charities. It wasn't a part of how he thought. And he didn't, this is just fun fact, not only did he not keep kosher, but even after he had become a prominent leader in the Zionist movement, Brandeis still every year got a big ham from his brother Alfred, who was back in Louisville. And he wrote to his brother, quote, "There is great rejoicing over the ham, which has just arrived." But really, he does have this conversion. By 1914, he becomes the leader of the American Zionist movement. And then he begins to play a really critical role behind the scenes, always kind of working the refs, in formulating and winning support in the Woodrow Wilson administration for the Balfour Declaration. He becomes so enmeshed with the American Zionist movement that in 1917, he briefly thought about resigning from the court to do nothing but full-time work as an American Zionist. It's worth noting that he really is the only justice who had, in addition to his life on the court as a Jewish justice, an entirely separate life as a prominent American Jewish leader. No one else has ever even attempted to do that kind of balancing act. The last thought on Brandeis, and it dovetails with what we talked about a little bit earlier, he developed a really robust tradition on hiring clerks, and he had a very long career. He went out of his way to pick Jewish clerks, went out of his way to pick middle-class Jewish clerks from Harvard who might not have another entree into the big leagues. He really saw his role as cultivating the next generation of Jewish thinkers and leaders that came along. If you look at the list of his former clerks, and they all unerringly go on to be great academics, prominent government actors, prominent judges and jurists, he really did sort of single-handedly construct this idea of, I'm going to build a factory of future great Jewish lawyers that in some sense becomes almost self-fulfilling in answer to the question, why is it that these chains kind of repeat themselves? It was really essential for him that he make sure to usher in the next generation of great Jewish thinkers and leaders behind him. So with Brandeis's appointment in 1916, we begin this tradition of this single informal, quote, Jewish seat on the Supreme Court. Between 1932 and 1938, there's actually two Jews on the Supreme Court. That's when Benjamin Cardozo is appointed. And then when FDR goes ahead and appoints Felix Frankfurter to succeed Justice Brandeis, then we have another Jewish seat in Justice Frankfurter and Arthur Goldberg and Justice Fortas, who we'll talk about in a minute. Cardozo, just another fun fact, Sonia Sotomayor, not the first Hispanic Jew, not the first Hispanic justice. It turns out that honor, depending on how you slice the salami, goes to Justice Cardozo, whose family is of Portuguese and Sephardic descent. Unlike Justice Brandeis, Justice Cardozo kept kosher his entire life. We mentioned briefly when we talked about this on Tuesday, but Cardozo was also a victim of good old Justice James Clark McReynolds, who, again, I think we talked about this, would get up and leave conference when Brandeis was speaking. He did the same thing when Cardozo came onto the court. He would read his newspaper in conference to avoid listening to them. And I think, as I mentioned on Tuesday, he would not sit next to Brandeis in 1924 for the annual court photograph, which is why there is no photograph for that year, because both Brandeis and Cardozo were the unfortunate recipients of just shameless, shocking, face-to-face anti-Semitism. Frankfurter is a really interesting character. Later on, it comes to light. And I should just note, Rabbi David Dahlin has an amazing book about all the Jewish justices. And if you're interested in this, it is really thorough and comprehensive and full of tremendous anecdotes. So I am kind of whizzing through this history in the hopes that if you're interested in this topic, Dahlin's book, The Jewish Justices, is absolutely worth your time. That said, Frankfurter's kind of claim to fame, it turns out, is that he didn't do enough to urge the Roosevelt administration to do something about the Nazis and the Holocaust. There was real sense in the Jewish community that he had, in some sense, not just abandoned the larger Jewish community, but even his own uncle in Austria was arrested by the Nazis. His uncle was 80. And he didn't try to intercede on his behalf. I think he did get Lady Nancy Astor to intercede eventually. This is from Dahlin's book, but there was just, I think, a long-standing sense that Frankfurter had not done enough, nearly enough, to help Jews in the Holocaust. The other thing about Frankfurter is he's an example of a justice. We often talk about how and why justices who begin as quite conservative drift to the left over a career. So Anthony Kennedy's an example of this, probably Sandra Day O'Connor, famously Justice Souter, famously John Paul Stevens. Frankfurter actually is one of the only Jews who does not stay to the left of the court. He, in fact, starts as a very, very liberal Democrat, a champion of every single progressive cause. And as he goes along in his career, he's got a 23-year career on the court. He actually drifts to the right in a lot of interesting ways. When Justice Frankfurter retired, he was probably the most conservative jurist on the Warren Court. So then Frankfurter retires in 1962. Anthony Kennedy appoints his labor secretary, Arthur Goldberg. Once again, this is the Jewish seat. Goldberg quickly resigns from the court in 1965 to accept LBJ's appointment as UN ambassador. LBJ then puts Abe Fortas, who's a dear friend and advisor, on the court. And then, as we talked about the other day with Rabbi Wolpe, Fortas gets embroiled in financial questions about where his money is coming from and who he's borrowing from. And he resigns in 1969, at which point Richard Nixon appoints Harry Blackmun to that vacated seat. And the 53 years of a Jewish seat on the court is over. Here's where I should note that it's over in part because when Richard Nixon famously is asked by his own attorney general how he plans to fill the Jewish seat, Nixon reportedly responded, quote, "Well, how about after I die?" So 24 years after that, finally, the Jewish seat is yet again filled. First Jewish woman as well, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who joins the court. And the year after that, 1994, Bill Clinton puts another Jewish justice on the court. That's Stephen Breyer. He succeeds Harry Blackmun. Elena Kagan, elevated by Barack Obama in 2009, becomes the 8th Jewish justice in total. And then for that interregnum, 3 Jewish justices sit on the court together. And to kind of close the circle, Justice Kagan now sits in the seat that Justice Brandeis once occupied. Justice Breyer is just an interesting character. He's probably the least self-identified as a Jew, certainly the least practicing Jew. I think I mentioned on Tuesday, he goes to Red Mass before the first Monday in October. He doesn't feel, I think, affiliated to any synagogue. And interestingly, by Breyer's confirmation hearing, the fact of his Judaism does not surface at all, although there's reason to believe, and actually no reason to believe that Bill Clinton thought about his Jewishness. He did think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg's Jewishness when he appointed RBG. And this brings us to Elena Kagan, the youngest Jewish justice. I think she has more in common with Justice Ginsburg than not. She grew up quite observant. She was the first female, famously bat mitzvahed at the Lincoln Square Synagogue in Manhattan. You may know the story, but she lobbied to have a real bat mitzvah like the boys did, and it was the first one. She was essentially, I think, grew up conservative, but really does think of herself as strongly affiliated. I can tell you, I interviewed her 2 years ago for my son's, I guess my son was in 8th grade at the Chana Senesh Community Day School in Brooklyn. And, you know, the Yiddish and the Hebrew and the jokes like tripping off her tongue. She is strongly self-identified as a Jew. And I guess this is just where I note she also answered the essential question my then 8th grade son had, which is, who's better, Superman or Batman? And the answer is, of course, Batman. I want to just devote the last couple of minutes here of my lecture to Justice Ginsburg, with the caveat that I know that in the week since her death, a lot of you have read about her and thought about her and made really personal connections to her as a Jewish justice, as have I. I think I first met Justice Ginsburg probably 7 or 8 years ago. And I was, as I think I've mentioned, really lucky enough to interview her in person at the court right before the court closed down for COVID. She was born in Brooklyn in 1933. She was raised in Midwood, a very Jewish neighborhood, in an observant home. She famously, you all know this, probably would attend a Jewish camp in the Adirondacks, and she served as the camp junior rabbi. She would lead Shabbat prayers and give like Dvar Torahs. And there is a story that's going around that she always wanted to be a rabbi. That's actually not true. I think she always wanted to be a lawyer, but she really was a fairly formidable, we are told, camp rabbi while she was there. Even as a teenager, right after the Holocaust ended, she wrote an essay in her synagogue bulletin that has been collected in her book, My Own Words, from 2016, where she wrote about the importance of remembering and understanding what had happened to our Jewish brothers and sisters at Bergen-Belsen and in the camps. The quote from the essay, again written by a teenage RBG, "There can be a happy world, and there will be once again, when men create a strong bond toward one another, a bond unbreakable by studied prejudice or passing circumstance." She gave a really beautiful speech in 2004 at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. And I just want to read to you one paragraph, because for me, it knits together these themes that we've been talking about how her Judaism and her justice work hand in glove. This was her quote: "My heritage as a Jew and my occupation as a judge fit together symmetrically. The demand for justice runs through the entirety of Jewish history and Jewish tradition. I take pride in and I draw strength from my heritage, as signs in my chambers attest. A large silver mezuzah on my doorpost, a gift from the Shulamite School for Girls in Brooklyn. On 3 walls, in artists' rendition of Hebrew letters, the command from Deuteronomy, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue. Those words are ever-present reminder of what judges must do that they may thrive." And I think I want to just end by saying this. Justice Ginsburg, right until the end, talked constantly in terms of tikkun olam, in terms of the mission to repair the world. And in her view, that was something that she saw as an absolute prerogative of the American justice system. And in her view, it meant making visible that which is invisible. And I think that her great gift, in my my hearing it from her was in trying to imagine what it is to be a Walmart greeter who is suffering unequal pay and sexual harassment, what it is to be Lily Ledbetter, who is getting a fraction of the paycheck of the men around her at Goodyear Tire, what it is to be a minority voter trying to vote without the protections of the Voting Rights Act. I mean, it wasn't just about the life she lived. It was about trying to imagine herself into the lives of people that she thought needed that leg up, needed to be pulled up and made visible and sort of hauled into the sunlight and given justice. And I just want to end by saying that Rabbi Lauren Holtzblatt of Adas Israel Congregation in DC, speaking at Justice Ginsburg's memorial service in Washington, said what I think is the embodiment, the instantiation of how Justice Ginsburg connected her Judaism to her work. And she said this: the Torah is relentless in reminding and instructing and commanding that we never forget those who live in the shadows. And that concept is written into the Constitution. Ginsburg, said Holtzblatt, carried out that work in every chapter of her life. So I know I sound like a ridiculous fangirl, but I will say that for me personally, that work of carrying forward and holding up and holding into the light those who don't have the privileges that we have in the America that we find today, that is the work I think that we all, whatever our religion, whatever our views, whatever our ideology, that is the work we have to turn our hands to now. I've been so honored and moved to be with you these last few lectures. I welcome Lori back and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Dahlia, that was just wonderful. And thank you so much. Really, all 3 days have been so inspiring. And if I may, I want to thank Abner and Roz again for bringing you here and even for that nice introduction for me. So the questions are pouring in. And I think the question I want to start with is, you mentioned that the legacy she's left, but more specifically, how do we keep that alive? Because there was only one RBG that we have here. And I'm imagining that people are saying, where did she get her strength from? Do you have to go through that struggle to have that impact as a Jew in the legal profession or just in the world in general?
It's a great question. And I'll tell you, I've mentioned a couple of times now that I have, my sons are teenagers, and the grief that their classmates felt, their female classmates, I mean, it is astounding. The imprint she had, not just on the little babies in the collars who are trick-or-treating, right, but on teenagers. And they're really in grief, Lori, because they're trying to figure out, how can I do anything like what she did? And my answer to them is sort of twofold, and I've thought about this a lot. One is, RBG starts Harvard, we talked about this, in 1956. There's 10 women in a class of over 300 people. She's called onto the carpet to explain why she's taking a spot from a man, right? You and I might just go back to bed and never come out again. She graduates top of her class, both at Harvard and then later at Columbia, where she graduates. She's number one in her class. She can't get a job. She can't get a clerkship. Nobody will hire her. Felix Frankfurter refuses to hire her because she's a girl. Felix Frankfurter, who, by the way, hired Jews, was really good about it in the fashion of I would have gone to bed and never gotten out. Throughout her career, time and time again, doors are slammed in her face. She can't get a decent job at a proper firm in New York. She has to hide her pregnancy at Rutgers because she's going to be fired if they find out she's pregnant. Time and time again, instead of giving up, she just puts her head down and goes, I'm gonna just do it. And if folks haven't seen the films, I think really, both of them, the biopic and the documentary, really capture that. So I think part of the answer is to not be knocked down, to just say, I'm sorry you think that way, and then just do the next thing. And you know as well as I do, Lori, she never did it by picking fights. She never did it uncivilly. She was meticulously polite and civil and kind. Her closest friendship on the court was with Justice Scalia. The second part of my answer is I really think, and this is just where I'm going to tell this corny story. When I interviewed her, I brought in my podcast crew and my producer and my editor, and I brought in the 20-something staffer at Slate who worked on the project with me and who had done a whole bunch of research, including like stealing the Harvard yearbook from the Georgetown Law Library, so we could put this project together of calling all the women who started with her at Harvard. And Justice Ginsburg spent an hour with me in this interview. She never took her eyes off Molly, not for 1 second. I could have been like a mug. I was nothing. She knows me. She didn't care. I'm old. I'm not useful. But the younger women, that's the future. That's the future. And everything she said that day was laser focused on Molly. And in case you think this is false modesty, everyone in the room clocked it the same way I did, that she would let these, these lines of 15, 16, 18-year-old 1Ls, 2Ls would stand in line to be in a picture with her. And she's dying of cancer. And she took a picture with everyone and she signed every book because she just felt that this work had to be passed on. And I guess the answer is this is why she wrote dissents, right? She wrote dissents long after there was no majority on the court because she was writing for them. She was writing to the future. And she, by the way, derived that lovely notion from none other than Jewish tradition that really encouraged dissent, because the idea was someday, if you're wrong, it'll be really nice to have it written out why. So I think all of this is of a piece with this indefatigable, I am not going to get told no. I am not going to get put in the corner. I am going to make my voice heard. And when it gets to the point that I am not able to do it myself, I'm going to turn around and lift up millions of young women who are going to do it in my stead.
So I'm just wondering, Justice Barrett has taken her seat. And what do you think Justice Ginsburg would think of Justice Barrett taking the Ginsburg seat?
I can see we're not going to get softballs here today, Lori. Okay, so I think it's complicated. For one thing, at the most obvious level, Justice Ginsburg famously told her granddaughter Clara that she wanted the winner of the election to fill her seat. And I think she would have been hurt and offended that not only that her wishes weren't taken into account, her wishes are not binding on Mitch McConnell, but that it was done in a way that was hurried and that was in contravention of what had been done 4 years earlier to Merrick Garland. So I think simply the unseemliness of this would have probably bothered her. I think she would have been delighted that a woman took her seat, because I think, she famously said when she was asked, look, you've already got 3 women, like when is going to be enough? And she would always say, 9's good. 9's a good number. So I think she would have loved the idea that her seat was taken by a woman. I think she would have been quite disturbed by Justice Barrett's record on the appeals court, which has been pretty consistently anti-choice, anti-LGBTQ rights, anti-prisoners' rights, for big business. I think that her record it's hard to imagine a record that stands in greater contrast to Justice Ginsburg's. And so I think in some sense, she wasn't quite essentialist enough to say swapping out a woman for a woman is enough. She would have wanted to look at that record. And I think this is a nice place to add, just because it's my favorite RBG story. She used to always talk about her male allies, always talked about the men who came before, who opened doors for her, the men after. It was really important to her to recognize that. And she would tell this great story, you probably have heard her say it, about when then Chief Justice Rehnquist, toward the very end of his career, having been staunchly conservative, often very much on the other side of RBG's jurisprudence. And toward the very end of his career, he writes this famous opinion about the Family Medical Leave Act, where he's like really in a deep and moving way, talking about how hard it is to like juggle, you're taking care of your kids and your mom is sick and this is happening and it's so hard. And it's this deeply feminist reading of the Family Medical Leave Act. And also coincidentally, because his daughter at that point was a single mom and he was watching the juggle in front of him. And Justice Ginsburg always tells this great story about how when Marty read the Rehnquist opinion in that case, he hollered down the hall, "Ruthie, did you write this for him?" Like he thought that Ginsburg had ghostwritten it. And so she always told that story sort of as a way of saying, you don't have to be a woman to be a feminist. And it mattered to her that Justice Breyer wrote the Whole Women's Health majority opinion. Like those male allies really mattered. Those were big W's for her in the win column. And so I think yes, she was an essentialist. Yes, she wanted women to be on the court. But I think more deeply, she really, really took pride when she made feminists contagious to a man.
When you looked at all the Jewish justices, how much did you see in them sort of the Talmudic tradition of Jews and how we tend to look at sources and how we struggle with sources? Is that come out in how they served as justices on the court?
You know, it's hard to say. I was really struck by, and you probably know this material as well as I do, but, you know, Brandeis, even before he becomes a justice, right? When he is still a lawyer, the thing he is famous for becomes known as the Brandeis Brief, right? And this is the brief that he would write for the court in which he would amass just reams and reams of social science evidence to prove some larger, you know, worldly point. And, you know, when you think of Brown v. Board, for instance, a case that desegregates the schools, how heavily that rested on a brief like that departed from strictly constitutional analysis and just starts talking about experiments with children, with white dolls and black dolls, and, you know, the social science of it, the fabric of life. So in some sense, it's interesting to me that is exactly the way Justice Breyer approaches the world, right? His head is basically an operative Brandeis brief. He's always looking to the social science, so much so that he drives the other justices crazy because he's always doing his own, like he jumps on Google and does his own online research, and it drives people crazy. But I think that line between that Brandeis brief, the sort of real world social science, I'm not going to be confined by black letter law, I want to see how this plays out in the world. The line between Brandeis and Breyer, I had not caught until I started thinking about it in preparing this particular lecture. And it's almost the opposite of the Talmudic question you're asking me, right? Like it's not parsing of language. It's really, how does this land in the world? And certainly Ginsburg triangulates against that. Certainly Kagan does. So there's a weird way in which, and maybe I answered this a little bit with Rabbi Wolpe, but, you know, Justice Scalia's hyper fascination with text and words and language and originalism, in some sense, is more Talmudic than the kind of array of justices I've just described.
Well, how much do the Jewish justices focus sort of on the underdog, having been part of a community that is often the underdog? And do you see that in their work and in their writing?
It's so often. And I think that's a little bit of, you know, what Rabbi Holtzclaw was trying to say in the Ginsburg obituary is that, and Ginsburg talked about this, you know, having been locked out, you're really mindful of what it is to be locked out. And I always think about, there's a great opinion in, I don't think we talked about it at length in this series, but this Town of Greece case where the town council would solemnize every meeting with what happened to every single time, almost with one or two exceptions, solemnize it with a Christian prayer. And this is this question of, again, is this excessive entanglement of church and state? And there's a really amazing dissent written by Elena Kagan, right? Where she writes, and it's quite soon after she comes on the court, and she writes this kind of blistering dissent about what it would be to be like a Muslim woman, and you got to come to this town council meeting because you're going to ask for this stoplight. And before you can petition the town council, you have to, put your head down and pray to our Lord Jesus. And here's the court saying that's fine, like no skin off anyone's nose. And Justice Kagan writes in the second person, as she sometimes does, imagine you, or, imagine you. So she's like drawing you in sort of imaginatively. And she writes this really powerful dissent about what effect that has on the outsider. And then later in 2014, in an interview, Justice Ginsburg was asked, why did you assign that dissent to Elena Kagan? And I love this line. Quote, she was an outsider even in her own religion. She had to fight to be the first girl bat mitzvahed in her Orthodox synagogue. I think she has that sensitivity. It's something my colleagues don't really get because they've never been in that situation. And I loved Ginsburg maybe slightly like importing her own issues onto Kagan in that story, but, sort of saying, again, she had to fight. She was locked out. She couldn't access it. The underdog. And so, I had the power to assign it to her. And then she wrote this thing. So I do think that's a through line of it could happen to you. It has happened to us. And that the difference is that we have, instead of like, piling our belongings into the back of the push cart and going to the next, town until the next pogrom, we have the force of the law to protect us. And so I do think that it has to be a theme. And it really is, I think, in different iterations, it is a through line.
I have an uncomfortable question for you again from the chat, but I think a really important one, which is why didn't the Jewish justice speak out during World War II? Was it afraid that we would be marked as unpatriotic? Do you see sometimes sort of Jewish in the profession trying to fit in so that they'll be accepted?
It's a great question. And I'm not a Frankfurter expert. I don't really know. I know that he did sort of secretly ask Lady Astor to do something for his uncle, but not in any of the chant. I mean, he had an immediate pipeline that he could have used. He did it in the most circular way. And I think that there might have been some element of like, I don't want to draw attention to myself. I don't want to draw attention to this. I mean, it's in such strong contrast what Frankfurter did in contrast to Brandeis, who really kind of put himself out there as a Zionist who single-handedly, in many, many cases, enrolled non-Jews into, the project of the Balfour Declaration and really made it his life's work to use his high profile to get Americans who didn't give a damn about Zionism to sign on. And he used his capital that way. So the contrast between him doing that and Frankfurter really given opportunity after opportunity to just say something, to do something, choosing not to, I think is such a profound contrast. And I don't have enough sort of psychological insight into what he was worried about, but I do think, there's something about being like the number 2 in, the number 3 in, that you really feel as though, and even Justice Ginsburg would always say, when she went from 2 women to 1 woman in the court, it was really hard after O'Connor left. And suddenly everyone's looking at you and you're the only, and you have to speak for everyone. And that is an immense amount of pressure. I think, and I'm not in any way excusing it, but I'm trying to understand what he felt he had to lose. And maybe in some fundamental way, it would be giving up his own Americanness.
Are Justices Kagan and Breyer involved in any Jewish activities, Jewish community, Jewish efforts at this point, or Zionist efforts?
I think Justice Kagan is just generally very careful to not have a very visible public life. Like, she really has made the decision to give far fewer speeches. When she speaks at non-controversial places. I mean, she has made a decision kind of to do the opposite of what Sotomayor or Ginsburg did, which is really use their rock star status at the court to special plead to the world at large. Kagan has, it's interesting because everybody was noting on Halloween that all the jack-o'-lanterns in DC were Sotomayor or Ginsburg, and there were no Kagan pumpkins. Like, nobody even really acknowledges her. And I think she's made a decision to just have much less of a public-facing life. Although I think in her own life, I mean, and certainly in conversation with her, she is very strongly self-identified. She, if you send her a note saying Chag Sameach on Pesach, you get a note back that, like, so she lives it and thinks it, but I don't think she performs it. And Breyer is really, I think, one of his daughters is a minister. I think he really views himself kind of as a citizen of the world. I think he considers himself a cultural Jew, but I have not heard of him going to synagogues and speaking at synagogues. That's much more likely to find John Roberts speaking at a synagogue than Steve Breyer.
I'm not sure if you want to answer this, but we have a great question about how the US Supreme Court compares to the Israeli Supreme Court. And do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't have really involved thoughts on it. I mentioned the other day that I did when I taught at Hebrew U. My students thought it was hilarious how much reverence Americans have for their Supreme Court, because I think Israelis think of even like legendary justices, even Aaron Barak, they don't think of them as like rock stars or intellectuals. They think of them as politicians. They're very unromantic in how Israelis think about their Supreme Court. And they think it's all a big kind of political grift, like they don't really believe, the fiction of balls and strikes, the fictions that you don this black robe and then you're tabula rasa, you're a brain in a vat who's never had a thought. Like, Israelis find that hysterically funny, that Americans buy into these, very, very operatic notions about a court that floats above politics and ideology. And in a way, I don't know if you've been inside the Israeli Supreme Court, but it's like the most open, light-filled, it's like a ranch house in, California. Like, it's so inverts the mystique and the dark secrecy. When I saw where the press sits at the Israeli Supreme Court, and I was like, what, they don't make them sit behind a column, behind a curtain, behind a bench? Like, that's where we have to sit. Like, we're like importuning them. And so there's just, I think, the whole orientation, and it is a singularly American thing. I think even, look, Canadians couldn't name a Supreme Court justice. I think through much of the world, there's just much less reverence. I always laugh. I don't know if you've heard Justice Ginsburg talk about this, but the Canadian Supreme Court has been televising oral argument since the 70s. And when I remember being at an event where Nina Totenberg asked Justice Ginsburg, look, if the Canadian Supreme Court can just roll in the cameras without incident and it's fine, why can't you do that the same? And Justice Ginsburg's response was, oh, they're Canadian. Like, as though, their lawyers, of course, are not going to, act up in front of the cameras, but we have so much to be afraid of. So I guess and the same, the British Supreme Court also televises arguments. So I think the mystique and the reification and some of the really magical thinking around the US Supreme Court, I have never seen in any other country, certainly not in Israel, where they mostly just think it's another branch of elected government.
Well, we never want to leave you or lose you. So we have some questions that circle back to some of your prior lectures, if you don't mind.
Not at
and
all.
Mainly, I think people are disturbed when you talked about the fact that there are case decisions from the Supreme Court that allow discrimination in the name of religion. That if you're a minister, you can be fired, even though it would otherwise be seen as a discriminatory practice. Where's that headed? And what's the messaging in that?
again, you know this as well as I do, so feel free to weigh in, but I think this is the thin edge of the wedge. And I do think this will be one of the central themes of the coming years, that we are going to see, not just the ministerial exemption case that, has schools claiming that even if you're the janitor, even if you're the cafeteria lady, you're a minister for our purposes, and therefore we can fire you willy-nilly without you having recourse to federal civil rights laws. Like, that's a worry, right? That's a big, big shift. And it's a shift away from, in the name of religious liberty, you're now hollowing out civil rights protections. And, so we saw that in the ministerial exception case. We certainly, again, are seeing it in these funding cases that we talked about, where schools are claiming that if you fail to fund a parochial school with tax dollars, now you're discriminating against the school, and we've talked at some length about the Fulton case from Philadelphia, what it means to say we're going to take taxpayer money and our job is to place children with foster parents, but we're going to discriminate. Like, that's an amazing turn.
So let's follow up just for a second for that. I mean, I think a lot of people think it's great if the government is supporting private schools and religious schools, but what is the danger of that? What is the entanglement danger of getting that money from the taxpayers and from the government?
Well, I mean, in the schools case, it's really interesting because this is outside of the scope of what we've talked about, but these cases come up under state constitutions, and the state constitutions in multiple states have a long, fiery history of saying, we will not pay for parochial schools. We won't do it because it's excessive entanglement, and it's beyond the scope of the federal First Amendment. It is a state decision that states have taken, saying they simply do not want to conscript taxpayers into funding religions that they do not belong to. And so what got hollowed out, in the cases this year, and what got hollowed out in Trinity Lutheran, which was the precursor to these, is not federal protections, but even more explicit and robust state protections, where states have long-standing traditions where they just feel that it is an essential. They don't think we're discriminating against religious schools. What they're saying is, we can't take taxpayer money and force it to go to something that is anathema to that taxpayer. That was the principle. And you can agree with that or not. And there's some suggestion that these Blaine amendments, are rooted in anti-religious animus. But I think, at their best construction and their best historic construction, this was a real anxiety on the part of the states. And so to have a court that purports to respect state sovereignty and federalism, and the idea that states can, and in fact, emphatically should, make determinations about what they value, when you have state constitutions that say, we absolutely cannot sign off on this without really harming religious liberty of our residents, to have the court sort of upend that willy-nilly and to call it religious animus is a really, really, I think, very consequential turn.
There are a lot of hot button issues that are about to come before the Supreme Court. You've mentioned abortion, but there's also the death penalty, there's gender equality, there's affirmative action, there's protection of immigrants. If, as you said, the Jews and Catholics are put on there for proxies, whether political proxies or otherwise, how does this end up? Well, and who gets blamed? I'm really concerned that depending on how people see the decisions, then they blame the Jews or they don't blame the Jews.
It's hard, right? Because part of why we are having this lecture series is to unpeel some of that, so we can talk candidly, so that when the rubber hits the road, we're not blaming the Catholics and we're not blaming the Jews, and we talk about it in much more, I think, principled and coherent terms. I mean, I will say, I think we are now looking at a 6-3 court for the foreseeable future, in which And it is no longer John Roberts who is the median justice. It's worth saying out loud. The median justice as of today, I think, is probably Brett Kavanaugh, maybe Neil Gorsuch, who in a handful of cases might be a bit to the left of Kavanaugh. But the median, that John Roberts is almost immaterial at this point because he's not the fifth vote for anything. So then I think you're really looking at a series of not just the hot button issues you mentioned, Lori, because I think it's really easy to get caught up in this is all about abortion, or this is all about, we talked a little bit about how Justice Barrett was the first person who was unwilling to say that Griswold, that the right to contraception was settled law. So now it looks like the line is moving from abortion to contraception in ways that are really, I think, somewhat concerning. We've got several folks who've been put on the federal appeals courts this year who don't believe in surrogacy, who don't believe in IVF, who think those things should be banned. And so I think we hyper focus on abortion at our peril, because I think, as we learned from the Little Sisters case and Hobby Lobby case, there's a lot that comes in under, reproductive freedom and healthcare that isn't just abortion. And if surrogacy is on the chopping block, we need to talk about that too. But I don't want to get so bogged down in LGBTQ rights or in affirmative action that we don't also notice that the other big theme, I've said one big theme we're going to see is, these religious liberty cases that begin to swallow the very protections that, the court has otherwise put in place. But I think the other big theme is sort of the dismantling of the administrative state and the dismantling of federal agency authority. These are all these like wonky ideas where we talk about Chevron doctrines and we talk about the Chevron deference and the non-delegation doctrine. And this is all really complicated architecture of what it is to have an administrative state. And I think we have easily 5 justices, maybe 6, who are going to be really all in for kneecapping the EPA and kneecapping DHS and kneecapping, right in the middle of a pandemic, kneecapping the CDC. And that's something that's already, we've seen that start, but I think that that's something that kind of goes under the radar because nobody really understands, what it is that Elizabeth Warren did when she built, this administration or other. And I think or this agency or other, but I think it's really worrying that we may be looking at a sequence of cases that make it effectively hobble federal agencies.
And that can apply to everything from, I take it, environmental issues to immigration issues and the like. What can the White House, a new administration in the White House, they don't have another appointee on the Supreme Court. All the seats are full. But are there other vehicles? I mean, they do have the Solicitor General's office, and I don't know how many of our viewers know what that even does. Or, are there other things that can be done that at least will limit what goes to the court or direct what's argued in front of the court?
I mean, in some sense, I think, first of all, it entirely depends on what happens in Georgia. And, there are 2 Senate seats that are going to go to a runoff. And I think we're going to know a lot more about, the world will look entirely different depending on what happens in the Senate. But assuming that, it is the Joe Biden administration with the House, but not the Senate. And we talked a little bit about court packing and the perils of court packing in the last lecture. But I think we're going to see kind of a reverter to the Obama era, executive orders and progressives suddenly arguing really strongly for, you remember when DACA happened, it happened by way of an executive order. And you had all these progressives, jumping up, Don Verrilli saying, oh, this is fine. We can do immigration by executive order. So it's going to be an inversion of the last 4 years where Donald Trump has been saying, like, I can build a wall, I can take the money that Congress refused to give me and take it out of some other pool. So we're going to see a lot of executive actions, and then you're going to see those stymied in the court. So I think that it's going to be a complete inversion of the battle. And I think in some sense, we're going to see some compromises, I would guess, this is my sort of hope, is that I think that some anti-corruption legislation will get passed so that we'll put teeth in some of the emolument stuff, some of the Hatch Act violations, the really corrosive things that have happened. I think we might get both sides to agree that inspectors general are a good thing, and we should go back to having that and empowering them. So I think we're going to see some anti-corruption measures passed simply because both sides, I think, have seen what happens when those norms are violated. But I imagine we're going to go back to trench warfare of the, exact opposite flavor, the one that we remember from the end of the Obama administration.
A lot of people want to know how you think the Affordable Care Act case is going to come out and what the change in the court's composition, how that will affect it.
Well, so that was a really interesting, we could talk for hours about the ACA because no statute has ever been litigated like this has. And this is the third time back at the US Supreme Court, and that sidesteps dozens and dozens and dozens of other challenges. There is nothing that has been more litigated than the ACA. And I think if you watch the Barrett hearings, you know that the Senate Democrats made the entirety a referendum on the future of the ACA. I will say that when it was argued at the court, it appeared that it had fizzled and that it wasn't just going to be 6-3 to uphold the ACA, but possibly, 7-2, 8-1. And the reason for that is partly that this was a pretty bad challenge. The first two challenges to the ACA at least had doctrinal merit, whether it's a tax or a penalty. We can talk about, interstate commerce. That was at least interesting. King versus Burwell was about a drafting error. It was at least interesting. This was this kind of crazy theory that when Congress zeroed out the penalty, somehow what they really meant to do was kill all thousands of pages of the statute. That's what they meant to do, even though they explicitly said, we're not going to, pull down the whole thing. We're going to zero out the penalty. So what do you do when you're trying to argue Congress really intended to, like a game of Jenga, pull out this one piece and the whole thing comes down, when Congress, by its own terms, expressly refused to do that only a few years ago? So it was a really hard case to win. And it was very interesting because, we've talked about originalism and interpretation, but when the rubber hit the road, you could see both Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh saying, like, I'm sorry, go back to the place where you want to say that the entire law collapses because of like one decision about one, like that's insane. And so there was a way in which it got, and again, I always start with, and you probably start with this too, don't read too much into oral argument. It doesn't predict everything. But boy, that oral argument looked to me as though the justices were more or less, certainly the majority of justices, were just trying to figure out why we're all sitting here talking about this at all.
Another one people want you to predict is, are any of these election cases going to get up to the Supreme Court? And if they do, what is going to happen? So put on your hat and let us know.
I've been watching, I think the record as of tonight, at least when I started talking, these cases the record now is 2-30 of these election challenges. So that's like Trump has lost 30 of these challenges and won 2. And one of the 2 is very trivial, but both of the 2 only implicate a few thousand votes. So the problem with these cases is this just isn't Florida 2020. Florida in 2020, you have, 527 votes in a recount that's going to get you the whole state, that's going to swing the entire election one way or another. Here, unless they manage to do the thing that Rudy Giuliani is saying, which is throw out tens of thousands of ballots, like not 30 ballots, not we found evidence of fraud that makes these 80 ballots suspect, but like tens and thousands of ballots in Wayne County. Like, it's so crazy. And so, and I mean, that's aside from the merits of these cases, which, you know, if you've been watching, like, this is not great lawyering. This is like, here, I've got a Post-it note, and it says that a person told another person to tell another person to throw a ballot. Or in one of the cases in Michigan, the judge literally said, but what you've just described is triple hearsay. Like, that does not come into my court. And so, sort of in the aggregate, not only would you need to win all these cases, but even if you won all these cases, you'd have to win in 3 states or 4 states. So even if you could somehow reverse the outcome in Pennsylvania, you know, where you're talking about margins of tens and tens and tens of thousands of votes, you'd need to do it again in Wisconsin tomorrow. And so if the election had been closer, if we had what's called a margin of litigation, like we had in Florida in the recount, I would be braced for the Supreme Court to take this, and we could have a really interesting hypothetical conversation about what the court would do. I don't think we're anywhere in that universe. I don't think we're in that stratosphere. It's just not going to happen. Now, the court is sitting on one case from Pennsylvania from before the election that essentially had to do with the, you know, basically a state Supreme Court decision that said you can have 3 extra days, right? As long as the postmark is election day, we're going to let the ballots come in for 3 days. And Justice Alito, you know, after the court punted that case twice, Justice Alito issued an order saying, let's segregate those ballots, like let's hive those off in case. But even if you threw out all those ballots, it wouldn't make a dent in the margin in Pennsylvania. So the idea of the court expending capital on throwing out votes, like let's stop and talk about throwing out validly cast votes that people cast in a pandemic, often at peril of their health. It just seems like, in order to do what? Like, you're not going to swing the election. And so I feel like if I'm the Supreme Court, I'm not wading into something where there's such a huge downside, including signing off on something that actually disenfranchises people. To serve what? What does it achieve? So I don't think any of these cases, I mean, most of them are getting kicked out at the lowest court levels, but even this one Pennsylvania case, we're still waiting for an order. And I just don't think any of the justices wants their name on something that says, you know what we should do in the name of democracy? We should throw out thousands of ballots. I don't feel it.
Oh yeah, I know it's getting late, but just a couple more very quick questions, but very important questions, which people want to know. Do you think, since you've talked to so many justices and studied them, that they see themselves in a search for the truth, that is part of their role on the court?
That is a huge question, and like such a Jewish question. I love it. I do think they do. I think probably they would say more than truth, that they are in a search for justice, right? I think that they might be apt to say truth is kind of unknowable. We live in an era where I think agreed upon truth is becoming more and more elusive. So I think they would say they assume the truth of what's before them and they find justice. I worry, we talked about this a little bit before we went live, but I think it's worth talking about what we're getting now. And it's in part because too many decisions are coming down late on Friday night, you know, at 5 o'clock at night, and they haven't been briefed, they haven't been argued. The court is just handing down these orders. I worry about some of that because what they are setting aside in some of those cases, where in 3 sentences they just make decisions about COVID, or they make decisions about death penalty cases, or they make decisions about voting, is that they're setting aside truth. And that they are saying, like, sorry about your 250-page lower court opinion, but this is what we've decided. And that is new. We have not had, this is called the shadow docket. That's the fancy name for it. All these cases that are not fully argued, they're not fully briefed. They're kind of come in on an emergency basis and the justices just rule. Because I think what gets lost in the shadow docket is truth.
Yeah.
And so that worries me.
Well, of course, I'm going to give you the last word, but I have the last question here, which is, who is the next future Jewish justice, and did she or he come from Sinai Akiba Academy? Just no, seriously, what are we looking forward to as we look down the road here?
You know, there are so many. It's a great question. And I will say, with a little bit of overweening pride, that I've been so impressed with some of the lawyering of the past 4 years, and that I've gotten to know, you know, Robbie Kaplan, who argued Edie Windsor's case at the, she's my chavruta, like we study Torah together every week. And, you know, she won the Edie Windsor case at the Supreme Court. She's now representing E. Jean Carroll. She's representing the community in Charlottesville against the white supremacists who marched there. I mean, she's one of these Where's Waldo of really fighting, I think, for Jewish values. So, you know, she's one of the people that I've really been so impressed with. And she also is one of those people who would tell you in a heartbeat that her journey to the law is because of Jewish Day School. Pam Carlin at Stanford Law School, who is just one of my spirit animals, and I have long believed like is truly one of the smartest litigators, thinkers, constitutional architects of our lifetime. Jesse Furman, the district court judge in New York who decided the census case, who is just, I think, just prodigiously gifted. There's just, I mean, now I'm going to sit here and feel bad that Becca Heller at IRAP, who challenged the travel ban the day it came down and brought that litigation all the way through. There are so many, and this is not even to begin to talk about, Vanita Gupta, Sherilyn Ifill. I mean, there are Kristen Clark at the Lawyers Committee. I mean, these people are extraordinary across the boards. And they are people who, I guess, to go back to Justice Ginsburg, like the door would get slammed and they just the next morning just get up and wash their face and go back to it. So the pool is deep and it is full of really righteous people, Jews and non-Jews alike. And I couldn't be more thrilled about the future when I look at them.
Dahlia Lithwick, you are extraordinary, and you have given us such wonderful information and such great hope. And I want to thank you on behalf of everybody at Sinai Temple, and certainly on behalf of Roz and Abner Goldstine, who they sure know how to pick them. What a wonderful scholar in residence you've been. It's been just a privilege and a pleasure to be able to talk to you tonight. Thanks to you, and thanks to everybody who's joined the program. Thank you, Rabbi Wolpe, for putting this all together, and to Becca and everybody on the staff who made this possible. Dahlia Lithwick, we'll be listening, we'll be reading, and we know you'll be there for us. Thank you again.
Thank you. Everybody take good care. Be well. Be well.